Hello everyone, welcome back to Math Specs. My name is Stephanie and today we are going to be working through our practice set for multiplying real numbers. If you haven't already, you can go ahead and check out the previous video where we go and discuss important properties as well as talk about the signs for multiplying products. So let's get started. So on this slide, we're asked to name that property. And on the left-hand side, we have examples. And on the right-hand side, we have the properties. So we have to match them. Okay, so I'm going to go through the first one. So the commutative property, if you remember, now would be a really good time for you to maybe test your knowledge, maybe test your memory of what we discussed. You can always go back to the video. And if you made flashcards, you can review those. So for the commutative property, we discussed that this property of multiplication says that it doesn't matter what order we multiply numbers. So if we have A times B, it's going to be the same. It'll be equal if we multiply B times A. So this will be the same. So now I'm going to look to the left-hand side and try to find a numerical example that kind of tells us that gives us an example of the commutative property. So here I have B, I have 4 times -2, and that's equal to -2 times 4. So what this statement is saying is that if I multiply 4 times -2, I'm going to get -8, right? But if I multiply -2 first and then with 4, then that will also be -8. So this order doesn't matter. So this looks like the commutative property. So up here, I'm going to write B. You can just draw a line and say, this example goes with this property, like this, right? Okay. Now, for the next one, for the associative property, basically what this property tells us is that the way that we group three numbers when multiplying them won't affect the answer. So if I have, A times B, and I multiply those two numbers first and then multiply C, this will be equal to, say, if we multiply uh, C times B and then multiply A, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead to the left-hand side and try to find an example where we see three numbers. And here in E, I see that I have -6 outside the parentheses, and inside we have 4 times 2. And this is equal to, if we were to multiply -6 times 4 first, and then multiply 2. So that looks like the associative property. So over here up at the associative property, I'm going to write E, or you can just draw a line as well, so we can match these two. Okay. Um, Actually, the lines are getting a little messy, so we're going to just erase those. Okay. Okay, so for the identity property, if you recall, this tells us that when we multiply +1 times any number, we will get that same number back. So this number will retain its identity. So I'm going to go to my examples and try to find one where I have a positive 1 times a number. And here we have 1 times -12 is equal to -12 in D. So this looks like the identity property. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to write D as my answer. Okay. For the property of 0, if you recall, it tells us that when we multiply 0 times any number, our answer will always be 0. So this one's pretty easy. And I go to the left-hand side, try to find an example, and it looks like it's going to be C because I have 0 times 8 equal to 0. So this is going to be C. And for finally, the last one, the property of -1, this tells us that if we multiply -1 times any number, we will get the opposite of that number. So -1 is going to make this number either negative or positive, because if we have a negative number, remember a negative times a negative is going to give you a positive. So this -1 will give you the opposite of this negative, which is positive. Okay, so that looks like it will be A. So because we have -1 times 9 is equal to -9. So that looks like it's going to be A. Okay. So I really encourage you at this time, if you have not already, to make flashcards and to add some examples like these on the left-hand side to those flashcards so that you know what they look like, because it's easy to use letters, A times B. For example, for our commutative property, A times B is equal to B times A. But as a student, you won't necessarily see it like this. Of course, when we work with variables, we are going to see more letters, but usually you will interact with these properties with numbers. So I would highly encourage you to actually put some numerical examples, and you're welcome to use these or to use your own. Maybe you can add fractions, decimals, and definitely make them unique to you and your studying, because then you will retain it longer. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue to the next slide. And here we're asked to find the products. So if you remember, we talked about the signs of products. When we multiply numbers together, our product has a sign. It's either going to be positive or it's going to be negative. So if you remember, if we multiply two positive numbers together, we're going to get a positive number, positive answer. If we multiply two negative numbers together, we're going to get a positive answer. And if we multiply either a negative times a positive or a positive times a negative, remember our commutative property, then our answer will be negative, okay? So we're going to use these rules of our sign, so like our sign rules, or rules for signs, to basically find these products. So for A, we have a positive 8 times a negative 1. So I have a positive times a negative. So I already know that my answer is going to be negative. Now I go back and multiply 8 times 1. That's going to give me 8. So my final answer will be negative 8. For B, I have negative 6 times positive 6. So I have a negative times a positive, so my answer is going to be negative. And 6 times 6 will give me 36, so my final answer is negative 36. For C, I have negative 4 times negative 5. I have a negative times a negative, so my answer is going to be positive. So 4 times 5 will give me 20, and my final answer will be positive 20. For D, I have positive 12 times negative 12. I have a positive number times a negative number, so my answer is going to be negative. So 12 times 12 will give me 144. Okay. And for E, I have negative 1 raised to the third power. Now this is a really good review of exponents and how they are still relevant, and how you can use them for different topics. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to expand this, because remember, this power here, this exponent here tells us that we have 3 factors of negative 1. So you can write them just like this. And what we can do is use the associative property to find this answer. So we can just multiply these out. And because they're all ones, it doesn't matter where you start. I'm going to start multiplying here on the left-hand side. So I have negative 1 times a negative 1, so my answer is going to be positive. And 1 times 1 will give me 1. Then I bring down this other negative 1, because there's 3. So now I have a positive 1 times a negative 1. So my answer is going to be negative, because I have a positive times a negative. And 1 times 1 will give me 1. So my final answer will be negative 1. And you can actually commit this to memory. And if you already knew this from our exponents lecture, then you can just write negative 1. Okay. So I would also encourage you to make flashcards for these and to really run through them and maybe add some examples and, go through those, okay? So here is another example, another slide where you asked to find the product, but this is a guided practice. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video and attempt these, and then we will come back and work through them together. Okay, hopefully you got a good look at those and you have some answers for us to compare to. So for A, we have negative 7 times positive 3. So I have a negative times a positive, so my answer is going to be negative. And now I multiply 7 times 3, and that will give me 21, and my final answer is negative 21. For B, we have -3 times -2. So that's a negative times a negative. So my answer is going to be positive. And 3 times 2 is going to give me 6. So my final answer will be positive 6. For C, I have 3 times -4, and this is a positive 3 times a -4, positive times a negative, so that my answer will be negative. And 3 times 4 will give me 12, so my final answer is -12. For D, I have a positive times a positive, so my final answer is going to be positive, and 8 times 8 will give me positive 64. Hopefully you got all that. I know that you did. But if you have any questions, I always encourage you to try to find where your point of confusion is. Is it the signs? Is it the multiplication? Is it just using all of these together? Definitely, if you're confused, I would definitely encourage you to try to find where exactly your confusion is. Either it can lay in the signs, or maybe you're just having a hard time multiplying. But either way, we can help you get to where you need to be so that you can follow along, okay? So here is another example of finding the products, but we're going to be multiplying 3 numbers together. So we're going to be using the associative property. And in these slides, you can multiply them differently than I do. So for example, for A, I can start here with -2 times -6, right? But you may not like that. You may say, well, no, I want to start with -6 and +3. And that's totally fine, because we're going to get the same answer. Okay. Or maybe someone else will say, I don't want to multiply just left and right. I'm going to multiply -2 and 3. And then I'm going to multiply -6. Okay. So either way, I would encourage you to do it as many ways as you like, to really prove to yourself that it will give you the same answer. Okay. So let's begin. So I have -2 and -6. I'm actually going to multiply these two together because I know that a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive. So -2 times -6 is going to give me a positive 12. And I'll bring down my 3. So 12 times 3, because they're both positive, positive 12 times positive 3 will give me a positive answer. So 12 times 3 will give me 36. And this will be my final answer. And I would encourage you to do this differently. So instead of starting at right here on the left-hand side, maybe you can start here. So if we were to start, if we were to multiply -6 times 3, I know that a negative times a positive is going to give me a negative. So I'm going to write a parentheses. And 6 times 3 is going to give me 18. Now I bring down my -2. And here the parentheses are really important, because if we didn't write them, we would be confused and maybe confuse this for subtraction. So without the parentheses, your reader or your teacher, or maybe even you, would think that this is that this is subtraction and not multiplication. So remember to use the grouping symbols, also known as the parentheses, to avoid just common mistakes like this where we don't know exactly what we're referring to. So here we have -2 times -18. So a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive, and 2 times 18 will give me 36. Okay, and you can, if you didn't, you can just do this, carry the 1 and 36. Okay, so that is another way to do it. And I would encourage you to do it another way for all of these examples. Okay. So for B, I have 7 times -1 times 0. Now, if you are a clever algebra student, you can probably say, well, I see that there's a 0, so it doesn't matter what I multiply it, because it's just going to be 0. You can just write 0 and move on to the next example. But we're going to work through this because we want to build ourselves up to that level where we are confident in our in our problem solving skills. So here we have 7 times -1 times 0. So I'm going to multiply 7 times -1. So positive 7 times a -1 is going to give me a negative number, and 7 times 1 will give me 7. And my answer will be -7 for this product. So here I will bring down 0, and -7 times 0, well, anything times 0 will be 0. Okay? So, or you can do it like this. You can multiply -1 times 0, and that anything times 0 is 0. Then I can bring down my positive 7. 7 times 0, well, anything times 0 will give me 0. Okay? For C, I have -5 times -4 times -2. So I am going to begin over here. I'm going to multiply -4 times -2. Because it's a negative times a negative, I know my answer is going to be positive, and it'll be an 8 because 4 times 2 is 8. Then I'll bring down my -5. -5 times 8, well, that is going to give me a negative answer because the negative times a positive will give me a negative, and 5 times 8 will give me 40. So that's my answer. You can also do this another way. You can multiply -5 times -4, and then multiply -2. So here I'll have -5 times -4. This will give me positive 20. And I'll bring down my -2. Remember to retain those parentheses. Don't drop them just yet. So now we have positive 20 times a -2. So this will give me a negative answer because a positive times a negative will give me a negative. 20 times 2 will give me 40. And my final answer will be -40. Okay? For D, I have this power 4 raised to the second power, and I have a negative sign outside. So what I can do is actually write this -1 as a 1, because this right here is a -1. It's just invisible. So here I can write out my 2 factors of 4, because this exponent tells us we have 2 factors of 4, of positive 4. So now I can just multiply it as we've been doing in the previous examples. So I can start with -1 times this, or what you can do is actually distribute, well, actually we have to follow the order of operations. So we would actually do the exponent first and then do the multiplication. So you can do 4 times 4, that will give you 16, and then multiply the -1, and this will give you -16. Okay, because remember the PEMDAS, the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, this tells you that we have to do parentheses first. This tells you that we have to do exponents and then multiplication. So here in this example, we would do the exponent first, and then we would multiply the -1. So I guess I bet a better way to write all this would be to write our PEMDAS on the side right here. And we'd have our -1 here and our big parentheses, so 4 times 4 on the inside. So this would be 16, positive 16. And then we multiply -1 times 16, and this will give you -16. And why did we do this? Because we have to follow our order of operations, and exponents are right here. So this is our exponents, and they come before, they have a higher priority than multiplication. Okay, so because we have an exponent here, we have to take care of this exponent first inside of the big brackets, and then we can multiply the -1 outside. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. So here we have another guided practice where you can go ahead and pause the video, and then we will come back and check our answers together. Okay, so hopefully we have some answers to compare. For A, I noticed that I have a -4 inside of a parentheses, and all of this is being squared. So I'm actually going to write the 2 factors of -4. Sorry, I'm actually going to use the other. So -4 times -4. And so a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive, and 4 times 4 will give me 16. So my final answer would be positive 16. For B, I have 5 times 4 times negative 1, and I'm going to multiply 5 times 4 first because these two numbers are positive. So 5 times 4 will give me positive 20, and I'll bring down my negative 1, and 20 times negative 1 will give me negative 20 because I have a positive times a negative, and that will give me a negative. For C, I have negative 12 times negative 1/4. So here we're multiplying two negatives, and that will give me a positive answer. But, so now I have to multiply 12 times negative 1/4. So I'm actually going to do the multiplication to show all of the steps, and then we can write the sign at the end. So 12/1 is negative times negative 1/4. And do you recall how to multiply fractions? I guess is the question here, because we already know the sign. The sign will be positive. So to multiply fractions, we just multiply our numerators together and our denominators together. So this is going to be negative 12 times negative 1 over 1 times 4. Okay. So negative 12 times negative 1 is going to give me 12, positive 12, and 1 times 4 will give me 4. And if we simplify this, this will give me positive 3. Okay, so this is our answer. So we just multiplied our numerators together and our denominators together. And these whole numbers, we can make them into fractions by writing them over 1 because there is an invisible 1 right here, 12/1. So we just write our denominator, we just put a 1 there so that we can multiply the numerators and the denominators together. And then we can, if we can simplify or reduce it. And in this case, we could. 12 divided by 4, it gives us positive 3. So let's go ahead and continue. So here we're asked to simplify the expression. So we have variables now that we also have to use our rules of multiplication with. So for A, we have negative 4 times negative y. What I like to do is write out that negative 1. And because right here I have a negative 1, and just I pull it out. So I have negative 4 times negative 1. This is going to give me positive 4, and I bring down my y. Okay. For B, I have a negative 8 times z. So I'm going to multiply these z's together, and this will give me z squared. Both of them are positive, so my z will also be positive. And I have 1's here, and when we multiply these bases together, we add their exponents. So this will be squared. You can write them a little closer than I did. So you can write them next to each other. Z squared. Okay. So for C, I have negative 2 times 5 times negative x times negative x. So I'm actually going to simplify the numbers first. I'm going to multiply negative 2 times 5, and this will give me negative 10, because a negative times a positive will give me a negative. And now for this, I have a negative x times a negative x. So I'm actually going to write out the negative numbers and multiply those. So negative 1 times negative 1 is going to give me a positive 1. And then negative 10 times 1 is going to give me negative 10, so that doesn't change. But here I have x times x, so I do the same thing. So they're both positive. So if you multiply this, the bases stay the same, and we add the exponents. So this will be 2. So our final answer is negative 10x squared. For D, I have negative 2 times negative x, and negative x is in the parentheses, and it's being squared. So I'm going to expand that, so negative x times negative x. So what I can do is also do the same thing, which is pull out those negative 1's. Actually, I'm going to erase that. So I have a negative 2, and I have two negative 1's in here. So negative 1 times negative 1 is going to give me a positive 1. So I'm left with x times x. And here to multiply these, I add their exponents and keep the base the same. So my final answer will be x squared. So final answer is negative 2x squared. Okay. So let's go ahead and continue to the next slide. So here we're asked to evaluate the expressions when given a value for the variable. So what we're going to do is substitute and then simplify. So here I have negative 8d, and we're asked to evaluate when d is equal to 5. So we're going to substitute 5 wherever we see d, and then just multiply. So negative 8 times a positive 5 will give me a negative 40, because a negative times a positive will give me a negative. For b, I have 3 times negative 4 times n, and we're asked to evaluate when n is equal to 2. But before I do that, I'm going to clean this up a little bit. I can multiply the 3 times the negative 4, and this will give me negative 12, and then I bring down my n. Now I can substitute, okay? So when n is equal to 2, I can substitute 2 wherever I see n. So negative 12 times positive 2 will give me negative 24. And that's my answer for that. Okay. Let's go ahead and continue to the next slide. And here we're also asked to evaluate the expressions. And so for a, I have negative 3 times negative a times negative a. So I'm going to clean this up again. I have negative 3, and I can actually pull out all those negative ones, those 2 negative ones in front of those a's. So 3 times negative 1 is going to give me positive 3 times a negative 1, because I bring everything down. This will give me negative 3. And then a times a, I keep my base the same, but I add the exponents. This will be negative 3a squared. Now I can substitute. So whenever I see an a, I write in negative 2. And I can evaluate this exponent first. So negative 2 times negative 2, negative 2. So this will be, actually, might need better notation for this, so that there's minimal confusion. So negative 2 times negative 2. So this will be a positive 4, because a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive. And negative 3 times positive 4 is going to give me a negative. 3 times 4 is 12, so my final answer is negative 12. Okay. For b, I have negative 2 times 11 over 2 times t, and we're asked to evaluate when t is equal to negative 4. Now I'm going to clean this up first. I have negative 2 times 11 over 2. I have our t. And notice here that I have to multiply these two things together. I can go and do it all and do the multiplication, or I can notice here that in my numerator I have a 2, and in the denominator I have also a 2, so these 2's cancel. They cancel, and I can bring everything that's left, so I have negative 11t. Okay, but you could also do this, and we can show all of our work for this. So what we can do is do the multiplication. We can multiply our numerators, so negative 2 times 11 divided by 1 times 2, and we bring our t along. Negative 2 times 11 will give me negative 22, and all of this will be divided by 1 times 2, which is positive 2. Negative 22 divided by 2 will be negative, will give us, actually I'm going to write it. It's going to give us negative 11t. Okay, so we got the same thing as if we were to just cancel these 2's up here. So now that we have that, we can evaluate. So I'm going to erase all of this, and I'm going to write negative 11t up here. And now we can evaluate when t is equal to negative 4. So I'm going to substitute negative 4 whenever I see t. I have a negative times a negative, so my answer is going to be positive. 11 times 4 will give me 44, so my final answer is positive 44. Okay. So that is the conclusion of today's practice set. Give yourself a pat on the back. That was a very long set of problems. Today we practice identifying the properties of multiplication by matching them with corresponding examples. We also practice evaluating expressions and finding products and simplifying expressions in the end. Next time we will focus on the distributive property. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I really do appreciate it, and hopefully next time you can join us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.